Snow fell sideways over the black cliffs of Durakal, and the wind carried a sound that was older than the moon's frozen seas, the low horn call of the choosing frost. Every winter, the dragon clans gathered on the roost ledges to look at their newest hatchlings and decide which ones would live inside a mother's fire and which ones would be left outside it. Nobody wrote this rule down. Nobody needed to. It had always been this way, and the dragons believed the old ways kept them strong. Sootwing broke out of her shell just as the horns sounded for the third time. She was small, wet, and shaking, and the moment the cold air touched her scales, 5 matriarchs leaned in to look at her. Their eyes narrowed. Instead of the smooth black or silver scales that marked a healthy hatchling, her skin was covered in strange gray patches, like ash smeared over stone. The oldest matriarch hissed a single word, and the others stepped back from her one by one. In the old tongue, that word meant hollow, and among the clans, a hollow-marked hatchling was thought to bring nothing but bad luck to whoever raised it. No one claimed her. By clan law, an unclaimed hatchling could not be fed, sheltered, or touched by any dragon. She was carried by her exhausted mother to the far edge of the roost, set down in the open snow, and left there. Her mother did not look back. It was not cruelty. It was fear, the kind of fear that had been passed down so many generations that no one questioned it anymore. The storm grew worse as the night went on. Sootwing tried to crawl toward the rocks for shelter, but her legs were too weak and the wind too strong. She cried out, a thin broken sound, and no one came. Far below the roost, at the base of the mountain, a human cargo ship called the Whitfield's Reach sat docked at a supply platform, waiting out the storm before its next haul. Most of the crew stayed inside, drinking hot drinks and complaining about the delay. But one man was still outside, walking the loading ramp with a tool bag over his shoulder, checking the ice locks on the cargo doors before they froze shut. His name was Dorian Voss. He was not a young man anymore, and he walked with a slight limp from an old injury he never talked about. He had a quiet way about him, the kind of quiet that made people assume he had nothing to say, when really he simply chose his words carefully and only when they mattered. He had worked on this ship for 11 years, fixing engines and hatches and anything else that broke, and in all that time, he had never once set foot near the dragon roosts. Humans were told to stay away from them. It was safer that way, for everyone. As he checked the last hatch, he heard something under the wind. It was faint, almost lost in the noise of the storm, but it was there, a small broken chirp, over and over. He stopped and listened. Most people would have written it off as the wind bending around the rocks. Dorian did not. He had grown up in a place where sounds like that meant someone was in trouble, and he had learned a long time ago never to walk past a sound like that. He followed it past the edge of the platform lights, out where the snow came up past his knees, until he found her. A small, shivering shape half buried in white, her gray-patched scales barely visible under the frost building on top of her. She was too weak to even lift her head anymore, and her chirping had faded to a soft, rasping breath. A dockhand named Faro saw him crouch down beside her and came running, waving his arms. "Don't touch it," he shouted over the wind. "That's an unclaimed hatchling. It's forbidden, you hear me? The clans will see it as an insult. Leave it, it's already gone." Dorian did not answer him. He looked at the hatchling a moment longer, at the way her small chest still rose and fell, barely, and at the gray markings the dragons had clearly decided meant something terrible. He did not know dragon customs. He did not care to guess what the markings meant. All he saw was something small and dying that still wanted to live. He opened his coat. The cold hit his chest immediately, but he ignored it, gathering the shivering hatchling against him and pulling the heavy fabric closed around her. She was lighter than he expected and colder than anything he had ever held. For a moment she did not react at all, and his stomach tightened, thinking he was already too late. Then he felt it, a small, weak press of her head against his ribs, searching for warmth. Faro was still shouting behind him, something about laws and consequences and the wrath of the matriarchs. But Dorian was already walking back toward the ship, one hand pressed flat against the shape hidden inside his coat, as if that alone could keep her breathing. By the time he reached the loading ramp, the storm had begun to ease, but the real storm, the one made of clan law and old fear and human rules never meant to be broken, was only just beginning. Captain Hollis Bray was waiting at the top of the ramp, arms crossed. Her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and dread as she stared at the small shivering bump in her engineer's coat. "Voss," she said slowly, "tell me that is not what I think it is." Dorian looked at her, calm as ever, and said nothing. He did not need to. The soft, tired chirp coming from inside his coat answered for him. The medical bay of the Whitfield's Reach was never meant to treat a dragon. It was built for scraped knuckles, broken fingers, and the occasional bad reaction to bad food. But that night, its one narrow table held something it had never held before, a shivering gray-marked hatchling wrapped in 3 heating blankets, with Dorian Voss sitting beside her, refusing to leave. Captain Hollis Bray stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, watching the little creature's sides rise and fall in slow, ragged breaths. She was not a cruel woman. She had built her career on careful choices and clean paperwork, and right now, both of those things felt like they were slipping through her fingers. "Do you understand what you've done?" she asked, her voice tight. "The Calvern Accords are very clear. No human may claim, shelter, or raise a dragon hatchling without permission from its clan. That's not some old story, Voss. That's law. Real law, the kind that gets ships stripped of their trade licenses and crews thrown off this moon for good." "She was dying," Dorian said simply, not looking away from the hatchling. "She was unclaimed," Hollis said. "Which means she was supposed to die? That's not our rule to break." Dorian finally looked up at her, and something in his expression made her stop talking for a moment. It was not anger. It was something older and quieter than that, something that had clearly been sitting inside him for a long time. "Where I grew up," he said, "there was a relief station for kids nobody wanted anymore. I was one of them for a while. I know what it looks like when something gets left behind because somebody decided it wasn't worth the trouble. I'm not doing that again. Not while I'm breathing." Hollis didn't have an answer for that. She looked at the hatchling, then back at her engineer, and let out a long breath. "Fine," she said, "but you're the one explaining this if the clans come asking. And believe me, Voss, they will come asking." She was right. Word travels fast even in a storm, and dragons have long memories for insult. 2 days later, a heavy knock rattled the outer hull of the ship, hard enough to shake dust loose from the ceiling panels. Hollis went to the ramp herself and found a massive gray scaled dragon waiting outside, his eyes sharp and cold, his claws digging small grooves into the metal platform out of habit rather than threat. His name, he said, was Grethack Ironscale, and he served as an enforcer for the clan council. He had come, he explained, to correct a mistake. An unclaimed hatchling had been taken from the roost without permission, and clan law demanded she be returned, either to be properly disposed of by her kind or, if truly necessary, ended quickly and without further suffering. "She is suffering right now," Dorian said, stepping out onto the ramp before Hollis could answer for him. "She's warm. She's fed. She's alive. That doesn't sound like a mistake to me." Grethack's eyes moved to him slowly, sizing him up the way a much larger animal sizes up something small that has wandered somewhere it shouldn't be. "You do not understand our ways, human. The mark on her scales is not simple ugliness. It is a warning sign, passed down through generations. Creatures born like her bring ruin to those who raise them. This is not cruelty. It is protection, for her and for us." "She's a baby," Dorian said. "Babies don't bring ruin. They just need somebody to not give up on them." The two of them stood there a long moment, human and dragon, neither backing down, the wind picking up loose snow between them. Hollis's mind raced through every regulation she had ever memorized, searching for anything that might stop this from becoming a fight she couldn't win. And then, buried deep in her memory from a contract negotiation years ago, something surfaced. "Wait," she said, stepping forward. "The old trade compact. Section on bonded creatures. If a creature has already imprinted on a guardian before a formal claim dispute begins, the guardian has the right to petition the clan council directly, rather than surrender the creature on the spot. It's obscure, but it's still on the books." Grethack's jaw tightened. It was clear he had not expected a human to know clan trade law, obscure or not. "That clause has not been invoked in longer than your species has walked among the stars," he said. "Then it's about time somebody did," Dorian said. For a moment, it looked as though Grethack might simply push past both of them and take the hatchling by force. His claws flexed, his wings shifted, and the air around him seemed to grow heavier. But something held him back, perhaps duty, perhaps curiosity, perhaps the simple fact that killing a hatchling in front of witnesses who could quote clan law was not a clean or quiet way to end this. The matriarchs will hear of this, he said finally, backing a step away. They will decide whether this claim means anything at all. Until then, human, know that you have made yourself a name among my people. Whether that name brings you honor or ruin will not be up to you. He turned and launched into the gray sky without another word, leaving Dorian standing on the ramp with the wind still tugging at his coat. And somewhere behind him, inside the ship, a small hatchling had just woken up and begun to cry for him by the only sound she associated with safety, his footsteps. 3 months passed, and the small shivering thing that once fit inside a coat now had to duck to walk through the cargo hold doors. Sootwing had grown faster than anyone expected, her body stretching out into long limbs and a sturdy tail, though her gray markings had not faded at all. If anything, they had grown sharper, more defined, standing out clearly against the darker scales around them. She followed Dorian everywhere she could, curling up near his feet while he worked on the ship's engines, chirping impatiently whenever he took too long on a task and ignored her. Word of the strange bond between the human engineer and the marked hatchling had spread across Duracal's trading routes, mostly as gossip and jokes at first, but slowly, it began attracting more serious attention. One of those was a dragon named Orc Comwind, a scholar and translator who had spent decades studying old clan records that most dragons preferred to forget existed. He arrived at the ship one afternoon, not with threats like Grethak had, but with careful questions and an old data crystal tucked under one wing. "I've read the old texts on the Hollow Blight," Orc said, settling carefully into the cargo hold so as not to knock anything over with his tail. "Most dragons believe it is simple superstition, bad luck passed down from mouth to mouth. But superstitions do not usually come from nothing. I wanted to know where this one began." Dorian wiped grease from his hands and gestured for him to continue, while Sootwing peeked out from behind a stack of crates, watching the visitor with cautious curiosity. "Long before the current clans rose to power," Ord explained, "there was another line of dragons, one that lived higher in the clouds than any clan flies today. They were called the Deep Sky Line, and their scales carried the very markings your hatchling wears now. They were not cursed. They were simply different, gifted with senses and abilities the lowland clans did not have. And that difference made the ruling families of that time afraid." "Afraid enough to do what?" Dorian asked, already suspecting the answer from the tightness in Ort's voice. "Afraid enough to end them," Ort said quietly. "Generations ago, the ruling clans moved against the Deep Sky Line and wiped them out, calling it necessary for the safety of all dragonkind. Afterward, to make sure no one ever tried to bring that bloodline back, they spread a new story. They turned the deep sky markings into a curse, a warning, something every mother would recoil from on instinct, without ever needing to be told why." The cargo hold was silent except for the low hum of the ship's engines. Dorian looked over at Sootwing, who had crept closer during the conversation and was now resting her head against his boot, and for the first time, the pieces of the last 3 months began fitting together into something much bigger than a stray hatchling and a stubborn engineer. "So she's not cursed," Dorian said slowly. "She's just proof that the story the clans tell themselves isn't true." "Worse than that," Ort said. "She's proof that a line the ruling families destroyed on purpose has returned. That makes her more than an inconvenience to them. It makes her a threat to the version of history they've built their power on." As if to punctuate the point, Sootwing shifted uncomfortably, and faint lines of pale light traced briefly along the gray patches on her scales before fading again, something Dorian had noticed happening more often lately, whenever she grew upset or scared. Ort's eyes widened slightly at the sight. "That," he said carefully, "is not something any current clan dragon can do. That is a deep sky trait, one the old texts describe clearly. If others see that, there will be no more denying what she is." Dorian felt a familiar tightness settle into his chest, the same feeling he'd had back on that supply platform in the snow, the sense that walking away now was simply not something he was built to do, whatever it cost him. "Then we don't let others see it until we know how to protect her when they do," he said. That plan lasted exactly 6 days. On a routine supply run to the lower trading docks, With Suitwing tucked into the cargo sled beside crates of parts, a sudden shadow fell across the loading yard. A dark-scaled dragon dropped from above, faster and quieter than any normal approach, claws extended, aimed directly at the sled. Dorian barely had time to shove Suitwing behind a stack of crates before the attacker's claws tore through metal instead of scale, sparks flying in every direction. Orrit, who had come along to help translate trade paperwork, let out a sharp warning cry and slammed his tail into the attacker's side, throwing off its next strike just enough for Dorian to drag Suitwing further back. The attacker hissed, circled once, and seeing the odds no longer in its favor, launched back into the sky and vanished before anyone could get a clear look at its markings. Dorian knelt beside Suitwing, checking her over with shaking hands, relief and fury both rising in his chest at once. She was unharmed, but terrified, her pale light flickering rapidly along her scales as she pressed herself against him. Orrit landed heavily beside them, breathing hard. "That was no accident," he said grimly. "That was a message. Someone wants her gone before the rest of the clans learn what she really is." Dorian looked down at the frightened hatchling clinging to him and made a quiet promise to himself, one he did not say out loud, but one he intended to keep no matter what it cost him. Whoever was hunting her would have to go through him first. The Judgment Hall of Durakal was carved directly into the mountain itself, a massive open cavern with a ceiling so high it seemed to swallow the torchlight before it reached the top. Dragons of every clan gathered along the stone ledges that lined the walls, wings folded, eyes fixed on the small human standing at the center of the floor. Dorian had never felt so exposed in his life, not even during the worst engine fires he had survived in 20 years of ship work. He kept one hand resting on Suitwing's back, more to steady himself than her. At the front of the hall sat 5 matriarchs on raised stone thrones, and at the center of them, unmistakably in charge, sat matriarch Cassandra Vale. She was old even by dragon standards, her scales a deep faded green, her eyes sharp with the kind of patience that came from decades of getting exactly what she wanted. She studied Dorian the way a merchant studies a bad deal, already decided but willing to let the formality play out. "You stand accused of defying the choosing frost," Cassandra said, her voice carrying easily across the cavern without needing to be raised, "of sheltering an unclaimed hatchling against clan law, and of harboring what our histories call a hollow blight. Speak, human, if you believe you have any defense worth our time." Dorian glanced down at Suitwing, who pressed closer to his leg, then looked back up at the matriarchs. He had never been good with speeches, and he didn't try to become good with one now. "I don't know your customs," he said simply. "I don't know your history, not all of it anyway. What I know is I found something dying in the snow that nobody wanted, and I couldn't just leave it there. That's not defiance. That's just what you do when something small needs help and you're the only one standing close enough to give it." A few younger matriarchs shifted at that, murmurs passing between them, but Cassandra's expression didn't change. "Sentiment does not undo law," she said. "And the mark she carries is not simple ugliness, as you seem to believe. It has always meant misfortune for those who raise such creatures." "Has it?" Orrit Comwin's voice rang out from the side of the hall as he stepped forward, having waited for this exact moment. "Or has it only ever meant misfortune for the truth you built that story to hide?" The cavern went quiet. Cassandra's eyes narrowed slightly, the first real crack in her composed expression. "Choose your next words carefully, historian." Orrit did not back down. He raised the data crystal he had shown Dorian weeks earlier and let its light project faint old images across the cavern floor. Records of dragons with gray-patched scales flying in formations high above the clouds. Records far older than anything currently taught to young hatchlings. "These are the deep sky line," he said, "wiped out generations ago by the ruling clans of that time, and their memory buried under a cursed story so effective that mothers now abandon their own hatchlings on sight rather than ask why. This hatchling is not cursed. She is proof of a bloodline your ancestors tried to erase." Gasps and low growls spread through the gathered dragons, a ripple of disbelief and anger moving through the crowd. Cassandra rose slightly from her throne, her voice sharper now. "Old records prove nothing. Bloodlines twist over centuries. This is nothing more than a historian's theory dressed up to excuse a human's foolishness." "Then explain this." Orrit said, nodding towards Soot Wing. As if she understood exactly what was needed, Soot Wing stepped forward, trembling slightly under the weight of every eye in the hall, and let the fear and stress of the moment do what words could not. Faint lines of pale light traced across her gray markings, pulsing gently in time with her quickened breathing, a trait no current clan hatchling had ever displayed. The hall fell utterly silent. Even Cassandra said nothing for a long moment, though the tightness in her jaw betrayed something far more personal than simple political concern. Dorian noticed it, and so did Orrit, though neither said anything yet. One of the younger matriarchs, a silver-scaled dragon who had said nothing until now, finally spoke. I have never seen markings behave that way. Not in any, because there haven't been any in generations, Orrit said quietly. Until now. Cassandra recovered quickly, her voice regaining its cold control. Even if this creature carries old blood, that changes nothing about the law the human broke. Claims outside proper channels cannot simply be excused because a story turns out to be complicated. There is precedent, Dorian said, surprising even himself with how steady his voice came out. The trade compact. Bonded imprint claims. I'm invoking it formally, in front of all of you right now. Murmurs spread again, some approving, some doubtful. Cassandra's eyes flicked toward Grethak Ironscale, who stood silently near the edge of the hall, and for just a moment, something passed between them that looked less like clan duty and more like a private, uneasy understanding. Very well, Cassandra said finally, forcing calm back into her tone. If the human wishes to invoke so old and so rarely used a clause, then let tradition decide it properly, not sentiment, and not conveniently timed historical theories. I invoke the sky claim in response. Let the human prove his bond the old way, through trial, not through words. Gasps turned to stunned silence. Even Orrit's wings tensed at the words. Dorian didn't fully understand what the sky claim meant yet, but from the way every dragon in that hall suddenly refused to meet his eyes, he understood enough to know it was meant to end this, one way or another, in the sky rather than the courtroom. Sootwing pressed herself tightly against his leg, her light still flickering nervously beneath her scales, and Dorian rested a steady hand on her head, even as his own heart pounded against his ribs. Fine, he said, loud enough for the whole hall to hear. Tell me what I have to do. The sky claim, Orrit explained later that night, was not simply a test of courage. It was an old ritual, older than most current clan law, meant to prove that a bond between Guardian and Hatchling was real and not just convenience or sentiment. The Guardian had to fly alongside their charge through the Broken Fangs, a stretch of jagged storm-wrapped peaks north of the Roosts, known for sudden winds that could snap a grown dragon's wing without warning. No human had ever attempted it, mostly because no human had ever needed to. Dragons could fly on their own power. Humans could not. She means for you to fail before you even begin, Orrit said, pacing the length of the cargo hold while Sootwing lay curled nearby, watching the two of them with worried eyes. Cassandra is counting on the simple fact that you have no wings. Then I'll need something that does the job for me, Dorian said, already moving toward the maintenance lockers at the back of the hold. It took him 4 days and almost no sleep to modify what he needed, a lightweight exo-harness, originally built for atmospheric hull repairs, meant to hold a human steady against the outside of a moving ship. He reshaped the straps and frame until it could instead hold him steady against the flank of a flying dragon, distributing his weight evenly so it wouldn't throw off her balance mid-flight. It wasn't elegant. Wires stuck out at odd angles, and the paint job was little more than scorch marks and old grease. But when he strapped it on his Sootwing's side for the first test, it held. This isn't about proving you can carry me, he told her quietly, checking the last buckle by lantern light. It's about showing them I trust you enough to let you. Sootwing chirped softly and nudged his shoulder with her snout, and for a moment, all the fear and politics of the last few months faded into something much simpler between them. The training that followed was brutal on both of them. Sootwing, still young despite her rapid growth, had to build the strength and stamina to carry real weight through violent wind currents, something no hatchling her age had ever attempted. Dorian, meanwhile, pushed through the ache in his bad leg every single day, refusing to let his old injury slow either of them down. Hollis watched from the sidelines more than once, arms crossed, saying nothing, though the tightness around her eyes made it clear she was not confident this plan would end well. The morning of the Sky Claim arrived cold and clear, deceptively calm compared to what waited in the Broken Fangs. Dragons from every clan gathered along the cliffs to watch, wings folded, expressions ranging from curiosity to open scorn. Cassandra stood at the highest point, calm and composed, clearly certain of how this would end. Dorian checked the harness one final time, tightened the last strap, and looked at Sootwing. Ready? She let out a low rumble that he had come to recognize as her version of yes, and together they launched from the cliff edge into open air. The first stretch of the flight went smoothly, the wind cooperating just enough to let them build confidence. But as they entered the narrow passage between the first two peaks, the storm hit without warning, wind slamming into them from three directions at once. Sootwing struggled to hold her course, wings straining against gusts far stronger than anything they had trained against, and halfway through the second peak, one of the harness straps, weakened by a hidden defect no ordinary inspection would have caught, snapped loose. Dorian felt himself slide sideways against her flank, one hand grabbing desperately for the loose strap while the other clung to the frame, wind screaming in his ears. He shouted instructions to Sootwing over the noise, guiding her toward a narrower gap between rocks where the wind might ease enough for him to fix the harness mid-flight. His fingers were numb, his shoulders screaming from the strain, but he refused to let go, working the strap back into place with the kind of stubborn focus that had kept him alive through worse than this. It was in that moment, wings straining and vision blurred by wind and snow, that something changed in Sootwing. The fear that had been flickering weakly across her scales for months suddenly steadied, then grew, spreading into a controlled, glowing pattern that lit the space around them like a soft lantern in the storm. She could feel the air currents now in a way she never had before, sensing gaps in the wind before they appeared, adjusting her flight path with a precision that startled even her. The deep sky blood in her, dormant until this exact moment of fear and trust colliding together, had finally woken up. Guided by her newly steady glow, she carried them both through the worst of the Broken Fangs, weaving between rock faces that would have torn a less certain flyer apart, until the storm finally began to thin and the cliffs of the Roost came back into view. They landed hard but safe on the main ledge, Dorian sliding off the harness the moment his knees would hold him, his hands shaking from cold and adrenaline both. Sootwing folded her wings and pressed her head against his chest, her glow slowly fading back to its resting pattern. The gathered dragons stood in stunned silence. No one, not even the oldest among them, had ever seen a human complete the Sky Claim, let alone alongside a deep sky hatchling whose gift had only just revealed itself in front of every clan present. Cassandra's expression, for the first time since Dorian had met her, cracked, just slightly, into something that looked almost like fear. Silence held the cliffs of Duracall long after Dorian and Sootwing landed, broken only by the wind settling and the quiet sound of ice cracking somewhere below. No one moved to speak first. It was Cassandra who finally broke the stillness, though her voice, usually so certain, carried a thin edge that had not been there before. "The Sky Claim is complete," she said, forcing the words out as tradition demanded. "The bond stands. By law, it cannot be undone." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the gathered clans, but underneath it, something else was building, something closer to awe than doubt. Younger dragons who had watched the glowing light guide Sootwing safely through the storm were already whispering among themselves, no longer repeating old warnings about curses, but asking new questions instead. Cassandra was not finished, however. She turned toward the crowd, her composure snapping back into place like a mask sliding over cracked stone. "Do not mistake one successful flight for proof that this bloodline is safe," she said, her voice rising to carry across the cliffs. The deep sky line was ended for good reason in the past. Power like what we just witnessed does not belong loose among hatchlings raised outside proper clan structure. This creature remains a danger to the stability of every clan here, regardless of what law says about her guardian. For a moment, it looked as though her words might work exactly as intended, turning fear back into control. But Orit Comwind stepped forward before the mood could shift, the same data crystal from the Judgment Hall, glowing faintly in his claws. "Then let us finally speak plainly about why the deep sky line was truly ended," he said, loud enough for every ledge to hear. Not because they were dangerous, because they saw too clearly and asked too many questions about who truly benefited from the wars fought in their names. "I have the full record now, matriarch, not just the fragments I showed the council. Names included." Cassandra's eyes flicked toward him sharply, and for the first time, real alarm broke through her control. Several of the younger matriarchs exchanged glances, clearly unaware of just how deep this history ran, or how close to home it might land. "You would not dare," Cassandra said quietly. "I already have," Orcs said, and gestured toward two other elder dragons standing near the back of the gathering, historians like himself who had quietly reviewed the same records over the past several days. They nodded, confirming what he'd said, and the weight of that confirmation settled heavily over the cliffs. It took time, arguments, and no small amount of shouting among the clans before the truth fully unraveled that day, but unravel it did. Records showed clearly that Cassandra's own family had played a leading role in the original purge, not out of protection for dragonkind, but to remove rivals who threatened their rise to power generations ago. The curse story had simply been the easiest tool to keep that history buried, repeated so often across so many generations that no one thought to question it anymore, until now. By the time the clan elders finished their private council that evening, Cassandra's title had been formally stripped from her, not through violence, but through the quiet, crushing weight of dragons who no longer trusted the story she had built her entire authority on. She did not fight the decision. There was nothing left to fight with. For Dorian, the following weeks passed in a strange, unfamiliar quiet. His formal claim over Sootwing was recognized without further challenge, and for the first time since he'd found her shivering in the snow, no one questioned whether she had the right to exist openly among the clans. She grew steadily larger and more confident. Her deep sky glow no longer something she needed to hide out of fear, but something younger dragons had started asking to see, curious rather than afraid. One quiet evening, months later, Dorian stood on the same loading platform where he had first heard her weak, broken chirping under the storm. The snow had returned for the season, but gentler this time, drifting slowly rather than driving sideways. Sootwing settled beside him, far too large now to fit under his coat, though she still leaned her head against his shoulder out of habit whenever they stood together like this. His old coat, patched and worn thin at the seams, hung draped over one of her shoulders now instead, more keepsake than shelter, a small worn reminder of where all of this had started. Not long after, a nervous pair of clanless dragons approached the platform after dark, carrying a small hatchling wrapped tightly against the cold, its scales marked with faint, unfamiliar patterns neither parent understood. They had heard whispers, they explained quietly, about a human who did not turn away hatchlings others feared, and a deep sky dragon who understood better than anyone what it meant to be born different. Dorian looked down at the frightened hatchling, then up at Sootwing, who was already lowering her head curiously toward the small newcomer, her glow flickering gently, warmly, in welcome. He didn't say much. He rarely did. He simply opened the ship's hatch a little wider and stepped aside to let them in. Word of it spread slowly at first, carried between trade routes and roost gossip, until dragons across the Calvern expanse began speaking, carefully and quietly, of a strange human ship that never turned away something small and frightened, no matter what markings it carried. No one knew yet how far that quiet reputation would travel, or what it might eventually mean for a galaxy that had never before seen a human treated as kin by dragonkind. But on that cold, gentle evening, none of that mattered yet. There was only a worn coat, a warm glow in the dark, and one more small life let in out of the storm.